So Navid, excited to have you in the podcast. I really loved your book, Mastering Executive Transitions, and then all the thought leadership pieces you published around that topic. I guess to kick off this conversation, my first question would be, why is the proper orchestration of an executive transition so important?
So, why is the proper orchestration of executive transitions so important? I mean, Dirk, I have dedicated an entire chapter just to this very same topic. But to give a few statistics away, I mean, firstly, 4 out of 10 executives do not make it, meaning even those that are highly established.
Mhm.
And in my book, I use six recent group CEO examples of some of the world's most admired companies. So this is not an issue that happens to poor performing companies or small companies that don't know exactly how to go about this. So that's one of the reasons. 40% failure rate is just shockingly high. And that is something that every organization is, better starting to look into it. The second reason is the high cost of failure, because I'm sure you will agree with me that if you have a very junior employee in a large organization and that individual is not doing their job properly and failing, it's never a great thing to see, but it's doable and it's bearable in terms of the cost. But if a group CXO really fails to deliver, I mean, the ripple effects can be enormous. And so the cost to the organization will not be just the cost of the individual, but it will be having ripple effects into the organization. So these are just two reasons to, hook us into the topic and get us going.
Yeah. Yeah, I fully agree because not having a CEO in place and not having the right CEO in place, the costs are massive if you compare to let's say the investment in recruiting and rewarding that individual. In a sense, it means that a complete company can come to a standstill or even worse. And if you think about executive transitions, given your experience, what is the number one mistake that most executives make when they move into a new role? And that's
Yes.
something where a coach or a transition expert can help them.
Sure, I think our fellow friend, Dr. Marshall Goldsmith, says it best. He has written, I think by now, 54 books. And one of the 54 books has outsold the other 53. And that book is titled, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think there's something really telling about this, core philosophy that just because you have been successful so far does not give you any guarantee whatsoever that you will continue to be successful. So, again, an entire chapter dedicated to what gets in the way. But I would say the number one mistake is to assume just because you have transitioned successfully previously, that almost future proofs you for any and all future transitions to come.
Yeah, yeah, because one of let's say the core pleas in your book is that you recommend that executive use a coach to secure a successful transition. Um, But from your experience, are let's say line managers, board members, and HR leaders not equally or perhaps even better suited for the role? Because after all, they're aware of the organization, they know specific circumstances, they know the history, they know a culture. So, what makes executive coaches such as you and me so suitable to do this work instead of the usual suspects?
Sure. So, firstly, I mean, I have worked with a ton of clients in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years that have stepped up to the top job for the very first time. So, there is something about, being a first-time general manager, being a first-time CHRO, being a first-time, CEO. And of course, if you have never been in that position before, there will be a lot of unknowns for you to deal with. And so, despite the fact that you may have been internally promoted, I think there's one thing to know about the organizational culture. It's a good knowledge to have. But if you've never really been part of the C-suite, as soon as you get escalated to that level, it's a whole different dynamic. It's a whole different level of politics. and a whole different level of peer interactions you have to deal with. And it really gets escalated and heightened at the very top. So I'm sure Ty Wiggins may have also alluded to that, who is a fellow coach as well in this space. But really, I mean, as soon as you get promoted to become the CEO, you do not have even what you used to have, which is your peer level anymore. The buck stops at your level, and you are starting to be cut off from informal communication channels. All you get to see is the management dashboard, and good luck trying to run an organization just purely on
Yeah.
what is officially available information. And so it really is a really different ball game altogether. And I think that probably sums up why it's a wise thing to work with someone like us. But if I wanted to really look at the statistics, and this is proven both by Egon Zehnder and Genesis Advisors, there are two distinct advantages of working with a coach that specialize in the transition space. The first one is the time to productivity
Mhm.
can be shortened by 50% or more. And there are other studies who suggest that if you are working for a large organization and you are hired externally into that position, into the top job, it will take you anywhere between 6 to 9 months to start to demonstrate the value back to the organization. And even if you were to be internally promoted, it will take you roughly 4 to 6 months to come to speed with what is the role demanding of me, what are my big to-dos, and how am I going to go about delivering on those. And so imagine if you were to shorten that by 50% or more. That is one of the strategic levers. And the other one that is probably even more important is to reduce the so-called derailment risk. So if you assume 40% as a baseline
Yeah.
failure rate, if the company and the executive were able to reduce that by 50% or more, that I think is also a very telling fact. And the third thing I want to say, and this is really to my defense, when I wrote this wonderful book, I was a full-time HRD, so I was not even looking to jump ship and do what I do right now in a full-time capacity. So really, I spent 5 years researching the topic before I was ready to engage with a publisher and kind of getting it on a paper and publish the book. So it really was born out of curiosity, and yeah, well, it is what it is today.
Yeah, because one of the things that I really, really liked about your book is the vast amount of research and statistics. Um, and what comes across to me is that it is such a compelling business case to engage, a specialized transition coach to help you to master, let's say, your entry into a new executive role. And the investment, let's say, dwindle in terms of, the potential risks and the potential benefits. So what, in your perspective, is the reason that many executives and organizations still do not utilize transition coaching?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is it's a relatively new discipline,
Hmm.
right? I
Yeah,
mean, if I think of people like Marshall Goldsmith and others who have been, in this space for 40 plus years,
yeah,
Marshall always jokes and says, 48 years ago when I started to coach leaders, I actually made it up. There was no discipline that was universally established as executive coaching. So I
yeah.
just made that up. And so, whilst there is a bit of a humor in that statement, it's also probably very true that, I think the coaching profession has only really started to professionalize during the last 10 to 20 years.
Hmm.
And with that goes this general trend that I see. I mean, I embark on a 3 year coach education journey myself to educate myself to become a full-time coach. And in those 3 years, I learned a ton. The reality is, though, Dirk, that it was more general leadership development coaching and less about transition coaching as a discipline. And so the analogy I would like to use is that of a GP versus a specialist. I think our field is like the neuroscience of the leadership. And so it's really started to emerge maybe the last 10 years or so. And really, probably the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, if I wanted to just go by the books that are published in the same space, I mean, my book launched 3.5 years ago, just short of 4 years. There was no other book on the exact same topic. And so the only other book that was around was The First 90 Days, which is
Yeah,
a general
yeah,
onboard kind of book. But Ty Wiggins' book, the other book that is published by this other gentleman, Claudius Hildebrand, from Spencer Stewart, the other book that was just published 4 months ago by McKinsey Partners around the topic of CEO transition, it's really a very new field. And so that is one of the reasons why not every single organization is really locked on the topic. And the second one is really because there's lack of awareness. I know many organizations that are trying to help their executives with the general practitioners. So they bring in their tried and tested leadership development coach, not knowing that there is a hardcore professional discipline
yeah,
called transition coaching, and there are people like you and me who can help a
yeah.
lot more precisely with what is the need at hand than doing general leadership development coaching type
Yeah,
work.
exactly. Yeah, because I think that the complexities are tremendous in the sense of, you need to and build a new agenda, and you need to create new relationships, and you need to find the optimum balance between making an impact but not basically creating preliminary damage, etc. So that it's quite a complicated discipline. But what I find interesting in your book is you already mentioned, let's say, the 90 Days book by Michael Watkins. Most of the authors in this field um, basically take a time frame of, typically 90 to 100 days. And you, in your book, you advocate for a much larger and extensive time frame. And there's even part about, the exiting process of the executive, which we will discuss later. But why do you take a much broader time frame than the classical 90 to 100 days most other authors use?
Sure. So firstly, I really tried, and I really tried hard to make the first 90 days work for myself. As soon as I was elevated into my first executive position, which was many years ago, I really tried to make it work, only to find out that it doesn't quite work out the way I had hoped it to be. Then later, and I've been a coach now for close to 13 years. When I trained up as a coach and started coaching leaders and senior leaders and executives eventually, again, I tried to apply the same framework. And I found out that it just does not work for two reasons. One, the subtitle of this wonderful book that I really appreciate, The First 90 Days, that Michael elegantly dropped a couple of years after the publishing of the book, said critical onboarding strategies for leaders at all levels. Now, I have worked in the field of HR for too long to know that if a book is written for a general audience, it cannot be fit for purpose for
Mm-mm.
the top of the house. So that is the one reason why I don't think it works. And the second reason is if you think of this formula, Dirk, that it takes an internal promote 4 to 6 months to come to grips with what the role is asking of them to deliver on, and an external hire 6 to 9 months. How could anyone really, be done after 3 months of being in a new role? And so, for that reason, my time horizon that I love to work with candidates and that I recommend to organizations is a 12 plus months time period. A, because it probably takes that long to really not only come to speed with what the role is asking you to deliver against, but also start to have some sort of an impact and value that you
Yeah,
can measure.
yeah,
But also because in most organizations, despite many innovations in the HR function, performance is typically measured in a 12 months time period. Targets are typically set over a 12 months time period. Strategies are typically broken down into annual plans or annual budgets or budget plans. And so, no
there,
matter
there,
where
there
I
is
look,
something with the cycle. Yeah,
there
yeah,
is something magical about the 12 months. And so,
yeah,
why would the coaching need to deviate from that if that really is the cycle of which everything else is synced in terms of performance in an organization?
yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I think most of my clients also extend their commitments beyond the kind of of an initially agreed 3 months period, because you're absolutely right. Because the difficulty is also, otherwise clients feel also inclined, they need to deliver that impact in the first 3 months, and the more senior the role becomes, the harder it is to do that. And also, let's say, the more difficult and the more, risky it will be, because there is a reason that organizations are the way they are. There is a reason that, let's say, things have been initiated and are running, and unless you basically invest the time and the effort to understand those reasons, it becomes a very, very risky enterprise. But what I'm also curious about is when you support executives during their transition, what does your typical approach look like? I mean, how do you typically start those processes? What are the tools you use? And are there any other people besides yourself involved in that process?
Sure. So, there are multiple tools that I use in my own coaching practice, and not suggesting that this is the only way to go about that. This is just my humble way of what I've come to appreciate and learn. So the first thing is, if it's a sponsored engagement, which is typically the case, so the company is paying for the coaching engagement, for the transition coaching, I will always want to make sure that I get input with my coachee from the sponsor of the engagement. If it's a CEO, it will be the chair of the board. If it's a C-suite member, it will be typically the CEO, or if it's someone below the C-suite, it will be the C-suite leader giving input into that. Because I find that if the organization is paying for it, at least they should get a high level say in what amazing looks like 12 months down the line. But also, more importantly, I think it's also helping the executive to really get clear around what are the key deliverables from me as well, as an executive leader. So that's the first thing we do. The second thing is really looking at diagnostics, right? So that is an assessment of some kind. Um, in my practice, I use the Hogan assessment. It's
Me
one of the
too. Me
most
too. I'm a
validated,
big proponent of Hogan. Yeah, yeah,
reliable tools
yeah,
that I have come to appreciate. There are a ton of other tools that are, I'm sure, equally wonderful, but I have just settled for the Hogan assessment because I find that that assessment
yeah.
really says something about the bright side, the dark side, and the inside traits of the leader. It then gets into the whether the leader is internally promoted or externally hired. 3 to 6 months into the engagement, I will also do what I call a qualitative 360 assessment. This is what everyone else gets to see from the leader. So the Hogan may say something about their way of relating to one another, but there is something telling about the way I've conducted this process to really speak to their higher up, to some of their peers, and a set of their direct reports, to then bring everything back and present to them as, okay, this is what I have heard when I spoke to the people that are close to you, and that can say a thing or two about your leadership, how you're perceived, what's getting in the way, and what is the one thing that would move the needle in the right direction for you. So that really concludes what I call at the outset of the engagement, the data lake. And all we are doing in the 12 months journey is to, nudge the leader a little closer towards the desired outcome. So this is just a super high level idea around how I go and contract with an executive leader that is typically a sponsored engagement.
Yeah, and when you talk about, let's say, that qualitative 360, how do you do that in terms of, confidentiality,
Yes. Mhm.
gathering data, selection of
Mhm.
people who give the input? Can you say a few words around that?
Absolutely. So first thing is I always ask if it's appropriate the HR leader to validate the number of respondents to this survey. So I just don't take the list that the leader sends me because he or she may send me the biggest fans. And that will clearly be an interesting view to look at, but it will be a bit of a biased view around what really is,
Yeah.
their strength and the development areas. So I usually use that as a quality filter. The second thing I do is those are all confidential conversations in nature, meaning I conduct those interviews either in person or virtually like this. with the incumbents, always assuring to them that no individual response can be traced back to the individual. But as soon as two individuals point out the same thing to me, that is when I will then get that as an extract into the output report that I will prepare for the leader. So the leader will be able to see the only respondent that they will get to see what he or she said is the line manager because there's typically one of them involved. In some cases, it's more than one. But the peers and the direct reports will be lumped together. And that's really important because we really want to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the process. And at the same time, we get developmental feedback about the leader and what is the move that they need to make in order to step up in terms of the performance and behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very good illustration, and thank you for that. And if you think about, let's say that the value you add during transition processes, can you share, let's say, perhaps two or three examples of the typical value that you add, or basically areas in which you coach, or errors which you prevent people from making. But what are, let's say, two to three highlights of the value that you add during those
Sure.
assignments?
Sure. So I would like to come back to the double diamond framework, which is kind of my
Yeah.
gift to this field, which is a seven-phase framework of
Yeah,
how.
and I will also include it in the show notes because I think that's really
Perfect.
the key of your philosophy, the key of your book, and I think it will be very valuable for people to see that. So I'll include that model in the show notes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so one aspect of this double diamond framework I want to use as an example here is the so-called five C's framework. So if I were, and I sometimes use this when I'm doing keynotes at large conferences, I say, who knows what are the four or five C's of what makes an outstanding diamond? And typically in the audience, there are some people knowledgeable. They say carat weight, color, clarity, cut, and certification, which really determines how valuable is a diamond. And I use a different set of C's for what I call the five C's of double diamond framework. The first one is context. This is arguably the most important C of all because it looks at the circumstance of the organization, the competition landscape, the government, and society. The second C is culture, and that looks at the organization, its leadership. What is great leadership defined in this particular organization that may or may not be the same as whatever other organization you came from, as well as the values and the guided beliefs of this new organization. The third C looks at commitments. This is, what is the organization committed to achieving for its customers, society, and clients at large? The fourth one looks at circles. This is one of the mistakes I see often leaders make, which is they just go by the org chart when they are doing their stakeholder mapping. And sometimes there are people that may not be the most senior person as per the org chart, but their voices will be mission critical for the
Yeah.
C-suite leader of that function to say yes or no to a proposal. And so this looks at the circles of influence, power, and sometimes informal decision making in an organization. And last but not least, it's the fifth C is looking at confidence. This is what about the levels of employee engagement and leadership DNA in this organization? And what I use that framework as is that I explain the five C's to the executive. I give them as a homework to start to think about how are the five C's in my newly appointed position same, similar, or different than the ones that I was just promoted from? And what are my mitigation strategies that I want to apply in my new position? So, what I really get them to do is I use the 5C framework for them to help to really take a step back and start to reflect around, the notion of what got you here may not necessarily get you there.
No,
How do
no,
I need
because it
to
also
show
gives
up
them the data
differently?
of how it is different. So what are the similarities, but also what are the differences? And it's great because that way they also internalize, let's say, the challenges they face.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's just one of the tools that I leverage in the coaching engagement that really helps to avoid the biggest mistakes. I mean, again, an entire chapter is dedicated to the top 10 reasons for failures, what gets in the way. But if I wanted to combine the top 10 reasons into three group reasons, this would be people, culture, and politics. So it's not the functional or the technical or the lack of those that gets in the way. It's really to do with people, culture, and politics. And that means that applying the 5C framework is a sure way that the leader is a lot less likely to tap into those mistakes or minefields that are due to people, culture, and politics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great illustration. Thank you for that. I like that. I like that notion a lot. Um, One of the things, and I think I alluded to that earlier. One of I think the challenges that new leaders face is the necessity to secure early wins, or identify low-hanging fruit, or make their mark early. Um, and in my practice, and I'm sure the same, you see horrible accidents happening as a result because people feel compelled to do things and to show things because that is somehow expected from them. So if you think about the pressure on executives to achieve early wins, um, what advice would you have for executives to effectively identify what those wins could be, and perhaps what those wins absolutely not could look like?
Sure. So, firstly, if we take a step back and think about the 5C framework, the first one being context, I
Yeah,
think that really matters here because, Dirk, I mean, quite frankly, if you were appointed CEO of a failing organization that is about to hit the iceberg, this organization, let's call the organization the Titanic, it probably requires you to come to conclusions very, very quickly because if you don't steer the ship out of trouble, it probably won't sail for long. So I think context really matters. And unless that is the case, what I say is what Ty says and what Claudio says and what every other author that's published the book right after me has said, which is resist the urge to make grand statements and big decisions in the first 30, 60, 90, or 100 days. Really, not to push it out artificially. But if you do not have to make those calls, do not make those because guess what? You are 50% likely to make the wrong calls
yeah,
early on simply because you just don't have all the data points.
yeah,
And this is the other aspect of the double diamond framework. The reason I actually chose that image is because if you look at the diamonds flat right next to one another, there is a phase that I call divergence and the other phase called convergence. Divergence is all about collecting the dots. That
yeah. So
means
this discovery and
first,
exploration. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
first 3 to 4 months into the role, you are still the new kid on the block. You're still trying to understand the role, the organization, the source, everything. And so it's perfectly fine for you to look all around and to try to make sense. But at some point, you are asked to start to say, okay, based on everything I've heard, based on every available information that I have now at my disposal, what are the 2 or 3 big bets that I think, based on all of this, we need to focus on, start delivering against? And so that way, what we do is they will still commit to do something. They will still make sure that those 2 or 3 big, hairy, audacious goals are more or less in line with what actually is deliverable and true. But what they are, not doing is committing to big, bold steps right, in the first week or month into the role without having enough dots to, base their decisions on.
yeah, yeah. Because if you look at a slightly, let's say, longer time frame, um, how do you think executives can find the right balance between learning and delivery?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is just follow the double diamond framework because that's really helping you to do that. And at every one of the 7 phases, what I've also laid out for the executive is what are typical challenges that I have observed in my coaching practice and
Yeah,
in HR leadership over the 2 decades that are coming your way? And what are the typical derailers that I have seen? Those are the big, mistakes that I have seen people make, which is, oh, I'm gonna take my time with my inherited leadership team. I'm gonna give it at least a year or two. And again, this goes back to the PhD thesis that Ty Wiggins, wrote about, which was what is the number one regret that CEOs had a year into the role? And guess what? The number one mistake, the regret they had was not to move fast enough on replacing one or two members of the leadership team.
Yeah.
Which again, once you know that, and again, the suggestion is not to come in and start to kill your inherited leadership team altogether unless they're all underperforming, which is highly unlikely. But to really, after 3 or 4 months, go with what we call the executive hunch, which is, okay, I've inherited 9 members in my new leadership team in this function and in this function, I really need something else. I need an upgraded version of this delivery capability. And for that reason, I'm not going to wait another 9 months only to collect incremental data points of what I knew inherently to be true, but
Yeah.
I'm going to move fast and decisively.
Yeah.
And that actually is going to enhance the overall performance that I will bring to the role rather than coming to the same conclusion 12 months later. And then, as we know, it takes 6 to 12 months to hire someone at that level. And all you have done is leave money on the table.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in that sense, I also really like the notion that Ty Wiggins posed in his book, in the sense of, would you have hired the same team?
Yes,
If you were to have an opportunity, you could start fresh. Would you hire, let's say, the same team? Would you hire the same individuals? And that's usually a great acid test. And I fully agree with you. At a certain moment, you have the executive hunch that you identified, let's say, the people you want to continue with, and the people where you have an idea of, look, for some reason they're not cutting it, in the light of the challenges we're facing. And then it becomes a matter of just collecting data points, and the relationship is likely to deteriorate anyway. So you're absolutely right that it makes sense in that situation to act sooner than later. If I get back to the period, you said you prefer the kind of 12
12
plus
months
type of
specifically. Yeah,
period
how
for
I contract.
the transition coaching. What is the moment, let's say, Navid, that you have an idea, perhaps after, 12, 13 months, that you have the idea of, I think it's more or less over now, the transition coaching. And so my curiosity would drive me, what does there ever come a point where, let's say, the transition coaching can be regarded as over? And then as a coach, do you then, step away and move to other projects, or do you and your client find a new new content for your role? In other words, you continue to coach them, but you change the type of topics and subjects you're coaching on. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So I must say I have now a sample size that is large enough so I can actually answer that question properly. So I've probably coached 250 plus executives on the transition topic by now. And so I know a thing or two about what when is the perfect time to step back. So which is one of the reasons, Dirk, I never engage below the 12 months time period. And I rarely engage above that unless the executive is going to another kind of transition, which sometimes happens. So I have 2 or 3 cases a year where someone gets promoted into the C-suite, and 6 months in, they get promoted again. And so that is a whole different kind of transition in its own right. And
Yeah.
so that means that the 12 months time period will start
Yeah, it's kind
again.
of a natural extension.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So unless that is the case, 12 months I find is a really good enough time to spend with the executive. And the way I design my coaching engagement is that we will be at the 20th session in the 12 months time period. That really gives us roughly a fortnightly rhythm to check in. And that is the session that I invest with the executive on phase 7, which is develop, where we sit down and again, the executive takes that as a pre-work to our session. What did I learn over the last 10 or 12 months? What mistakes did I make based on what information that was available to me at the time? What did I learn about making those mistakes? And how would I go about the same issue differently with the knowledge that I have today. So it really is asking the executive to take a step back and do what we know because of research works wonderfully well, which is reflection and reflective practice. But that is so unnatural to any executive leader because they are just focused on the next target. They are focusing on the next delivery, on the
Yeah.
next big thing. And it's really hard for them to take time out to really reflect back on the last 10 to 12 months to think about what did I learn? And what's the beauty about this particular process is that they would then embody those learnings as and when they move forward into a transition at the future time, even though we may not work together anymore. But they will have an inherent idea around what mistakes they made, what did they learn along the way, and how might they approach a future transition going into it as an executive.
Yeah. We already talked about team and changing out the team. Um, do you also get involved in discussions about, if they basically talk about their teams, about, let's say, keepers, so people they want to keep, people they may want to let go. Are you involved in those type of decisions? And what is, let's say, your input and general guidance?
Sure. I mean, I only do five things, and one of them is assessing
Hmm.
executives just in its own. So not necessarily combining it with coaching, but I often get, particularly from the Shrek firms, I get involved in, oh, we got two runner-ups for this top position. Can you do usually the Hogan assessment and give us a short download on what is the difference between candidate one and B? Because
Yeah,
technically both are competent, both could do the role
yeah,
and both interviewed well, but we want to get some additional data point on who might be a better fit. So that is something that I do, and of course I have a different product, which is the other part of what I do is it's a whole leadership team journey, meaning it typically happens when I have CEOs or CHROs as a client, as an individual client, that 3 to 6 months into the coaching, the question of leadership team comes up. And of course, by then the trust has been established. They have seen enough evidence to know that I am probably worthy of more than just being the transition coach. And they sometimes then turn to me and say, can you also help me with my leadership team? And that's a whole different product. It's a different proposition. It's a 2 year leadership team journey that includes four offsites, two particular assessments. One is the Hogan, the other one is the Dr. Patrick Lencioni, the five dysfunctions of a team. And so that is a different product. But I would say generally, it's quite natural that, once the trust has been established with the coach, that the team question comes up in the first 3 to 6 months into the engagement.
yeah. You also highlight the need for executives to develop their transition skills. Um, could you perhaps share with us what those transition skills are and why they are so important?
Sure. I mean, I would like to use a very standard example, which is stakeholder engagement, right? I mean, it's something that we actually learn to do, if not during university studies, but right after, and when we are in the first, let's say, position of power. And despite that, very few C-suite executives actually take time to sit down with the coach or the HR partner to jot down the critical stakeholders and to start to think about what is the level of support to the leader and to the mission that the leader is there to deliver against. And at the same time, who may be opponents, who may be critical stakeholders with a lot of influence and power, but not necessarily the biggest allies of the same leader. And then to start to think about, okay, how would I want to engage those critical stakeholders? How would I want to engage maybe someone who is fundamentally opposed to what I want to achieve here?
Yeah,
Because I can't just ignore them, right? I mean, that's probably not the best option, but there may be a way I can still at least neutralize their impact on my goal, mission, and objectives. And so it's a super simple case, but really taking time out with the support of the coach or the HR partner is really paying a huge dividend because, again, it's taking time to sharpen the soul to then go back and start using the tools rather than assuming because you know in your mind who the critical stakeholders are, you don't need to do anything about those. That you have them top of mind all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. What I never read in any other book, quite frankly, unless I haven't read them properly, is the attention you pay to, and also the let's say the material you write about in your book on transitioning out of an executive
Mm,
role. You
yeah,
dedicated an entire chapter about it, and even more, you also said, look, executive in that stage should not shy away from difficult people decisions. So, multiple questions. The main one being, why did you decide to include, let's say, a chapter about exiting executive transitions? Why is it important? And why did you explicitly point it out um, to think about, let's say, more difficult people decisions in that stage? So,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah. So firstly, this was really because Dirk, I did 7 companies in 26 years. So I had a rather kind of short tenure. The longest I had with the same company was 8 years with Vodafone. This is the last company I used to work for, and I did 2 jobs in those 8 years. But typically, every 2 to 3 years, I was moving into a new position, sometimes into a new organization. And that really struck me as one of the biggest levers in, if you look at the handover process as an end-to-end process, it cannot just start with the first 90 days of the new person. It really needs to look at, if this is a race, someone ideally is passing me the baton unless they have been fired or the role is created entirely from scratch as a new position. If you exclude those two circumstances, someone needs to hand over something to me. And the higher you go up on the hierarchy ladder, the more critical this particular aspect becomes, which is okay, I may be the new incoming CEO. I may have my own fresh views about how I want to go about this position and this team. But if there is an opportunity for me to engage with my predecessor, if he or she is still around, if it's appropriate for me to reach out to them, I would be foolish to completely ignore that or to assume that I know better as the new kid on the block. So that's just, data proving the fact that, if you look at process improvement, for instance, if you look at lean, Kaizen, or all these various other processes, there's something about the process to be looked at end to end. And end to end means the outgoing one sitting down with the incoming one and having some sort of a handover. Now, some companies are really having a great setup, like the CEO to be will be appointed designate CEO or deputy CEO, and he or she will run for 3, 6, 9, or 12 months with the incumbent CEO so that they really get inducted into the role. Not every company can afford that. And sometimes the handover is like a week long, is all the executive gets. And so rather than trying to come up with a whole new framework for this particular part, which I jokingly titled the last 90 days in your role, so using the first 90-day analogy here, I really work with, reflective questions. And some of those questions are, what did I achieve and what difference did I make to the organization? This is for the outgoing
yeah,
C-suite executives. What value did I individually and as a team collectively add to the business? Did I apply a learner or a growth mindset during my transition and inspire others to do the same? What mistakes or misjudgments did I make along the way? And this is bringing us back to the transition skills, being able to reflect back on the big decisions that not all of them were correct in hindsight. what did I learn about my strength development areas? What feedback did I learn about, my peers and my boss? But really, also, if I had another 3 years in this position, what changes would I bring about to my leadership team? If I had another 3 years in this position, what big decisions would I want to crack on now with rather than pushing them out for another year? Because I know I'll be retiring 6 months down the line anyway. So I don't want to really rock the boat too much. And so all of those can be super important value levers for the incoming C-suite executive because clearly, again, they have to take all of this with a pinch of salt, but those conversations and those reflective responses to those questions can be, very, very valuable to the incoming CEO or C-suite executive as well.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you. Yeah, yeah. It unfortunately it doesn't happen a lot, but I think it is extremely valuable, and it's also extremely valuable what you said to approach that in such a systemic way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, but I, I learned a lot from you, and I learned a lot from this interview. We covered also a lot of ground in the past in our conversation. Are there any aspects of executive transitions that we haven't discussed that you feel that are important to mention?
Yeah, maybe two things. One, again, is a study that was conducted by a joint study that was done by Genesis, Ego, and Zenda, which was a surprise finding to me. Prior to coming across this study, I assumed, Dirk, that the extent of key stakeholders is equally important to the success of the new executive. And that study particularly highlighted that you should not spend too much time on your peers when it comes to your onboarding success, because quite frankly, they are busy delivering their own stuff and they couldn't really care too much about your onboarding success. So the two critical stakeholders for you to bear in mind are your line manager and your direct reports. So that was one of the things we haven't touched upon, and I think it's really important to bear that in mind. And the second thing is something that I got into my hands quite late in the publishing process. I actually had to pause the printing button because I really wanted to include that survey in the book. And it became the 156th citation in my book. That was a study conducted by DDI, and they found out that female executives are getting less support than their male counterparts when it comes to transition support. And that really, blew my mind because
Yeah,
why
yeah,
would any company support the female executives less so than the male ones? And whilst this study didn't have that as a research focus, so it was a side finding, what I would like to give away to any HR leader that is in charge of this process in their organization is the single lever to eliminate any and all gender bias in this, which is you just attach the level of support you want to give to the level of promotion. Meaning, if it's vice president and above in your organization,
yeah.
if you want to equip those VPs, newly appointed VPs, with transition support, just make it down to the level and not to an individual coming forward and
No,
requesting those support mechanisms.
yeah. I think that's great guidance. That's great guidance. You could almost think about, standardized packages depending on the level where people come because they face similar challenges. So, no, I would agree that, and it also increases the predictability for organizations in the sense of, they could standardize this offer, they could standardize this as part of the process. So that makes a lot of sense. So thank you so much, Navid, for this interview.
Thank you so
I
much,
thought it was
Dirk.
very, very interesting. I learned a lot, and I can recommend everyone to read your book. I certainly found it very, very insightful. And as I said, I think the research you did was absolutely super. I really, really want to thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Dirk. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.